Old Brannick shuffled back to his corner with the same uneven gait he had arrived with, his boots dragging lightly across the warped wooden floor as he reclaimed his seat beside the wall. The man settled into his chair with a low grunt, hooking his real arm over the backrest while his single glass eye caught the lantern light. He didn't look back at them immediately. Instead, he reached for his drink, lifted it, and took a slow pull as though the conversation had already ended and whatever came next was no longer his concern. The room filled the silence for a moment. Wind pressed faintly against the outer walls of the tavern, carrying the distant whisper of the mountains beyond, while the few scattered patrons kept their heads down over their drinks. Jackson exhaled and leaned slightly closer to the table, lowering his voice. "Well," he muttered, glancing toward the old man's corner. That was both hilarious and disturbing. Dorian didn't sit. He remained standing near the edge of the table, one hand resting against its surface as his fingers tapped once, twice, in a rhythm that betrayed his irritation. His gaze hadn't left Brannick since the man had walked away. "I think he is certifiable," he said, voice tight with restrained frustration. "You heard the people here. They call him Crazy Old Brannick for a reason." "That's because he probably is," Gabriel replied calmly, his tone quieter but no less grounded. He rested his forearms against the table, eyes drifting briefly toward the door before returning. "Men like that aren't sane, not after a lifetime in a place like this." Seberic shifted his weight beside them, arms crossed, his expression set in the same hardened neutrality he carried into most situations. "I mean, he's seen enough to believe what he's saying," he added, "but it doesn't mean we have to listen to him." Juno's eyes moved between them, her expression thoughtful rather than reactive. "We don't have the luxury of ignoring him, though," she said. "If the main pass is truly gone, we don't really have another option." "That's just great," Jackson muttered under his breath. Cassian had been quiet, his attention fixed on Brannick in the corner. He watched the way the man sat, the way he drank, the way he didn't bother looking back at them again. There was no performance in it, no attempt to sell fear or impress them, just a man who had already made peace with the dangers he described. "He's not lying," Cassian said finally. Dorian's jaw flexed slightly. "That's not the point," he replied. "The point is that we are now considering diverting our path into an unstable, abandoned mining network beneath a mountain range that we have no knowledge or bearing of." Cassian glanced toward him. "We're considering it because the alternative is a dead end." Dorian's frustration lingered, but he knew the logic held. After a moment, he exhaled quietly and looked away, his attention dropping briefly to the table as if recalibrating. "We do need more than just a warning, though," Cassian continued. "We need directions." Seberic gave a nod in his direction. "Then, let's go get it." Without another word, he stood and started toward Brannick's table. Cassian followed a step behind, his boots steady against the floor as he crossed the tavern. The older man didn't look up until they were nearly on top of him. Brannick's glass paused halfway to his lips as his eye flicked upward, taking them in without surprise.
"Didn't take you long,"
he said, voice dry as old timber.
"Figured you'd either leave, come back with that there look on your faces."
Seberic stopped at the edge of the table, planting one hand against its surface. "We have no choice. We can't turn around," he said plainly. Brannick huffed a quiet, humorless sound.
"Didn't think you would."
Cassian stepped slightly to the side, giving himself a clearer angle on the man. "You said there's a way through. Through the mines?" Brannick leaned back in his chair, studying them for a moment longer. The glass eye stared forward, unmoving, while the other narrowed just slightly as if weighing something he didn't feel like saying out loud.
"Yeah,"
he said after a beat.
"there's a way."
"We need a map," Cassian continued. "Not guesses, not warnings. A path through to the other side." The old man let out a slow whistle, then set his drink down with a dull thud. With a faint shake of his head, he reached down beside his chair and dragged a rough piece of parchment up onto the table. It looked worn, edges frayed, the surface marked with old stains and half-faded ink.
"You're not gonna like it,"
Brannick muttered as he shifted forward. Seberic didn't blink. "We don't have to like it." Brannick grunted once in acknowledgement, then reached for a bit of charcoal resting near the edge of the table. His movements were slower now, deliberate, as he pressed the tip to the parchment and began to draw.
"The main pass is here,"
he said, sketching a jagged line before slashing through it with a heavy stroke.
"Buried. Gone. Not coming back anytime soon."
The charcoal moved again, tracing a rough curve beneath it.
"Mines run under the section of the mountain right here,"
he continued.
"Old routes. Some of them still hold. Some of them don't."
Cassian leaned slightly closer, watching the lines take shape. Brannick's hand paused for just a second before continuing. the pressure of the charcoal deepening as he marked a narrower path cutting through the sketched tunnels.
This is the way through,
he said quietly. He didn't look up when he added, almost as an afterthought.
That's about it.
Cassian didn't take his eyes off the parchment as the final lines settled into place beneath Brannick's hand, the crude map already carrying more weight than it had any right to. The charcoal marks were rough, imperfect, but there was no hesitation in how they had been drawn, no uncertainty, just a path carved from memory and hard-earned experience, cutting through something that clearly did not welcome travelers. He reached into his coat and pulled free a small handful of coins, letting them rest briefly in his palm before placing them in a stack on the table in front of the old man. The metal clinked softly against the worn wood, a clean sound in a place that had very little of it. "For your time," Cassian said, his tone even, without ceremony, "and the trouble." Brannick's eye shifted down to the coins, then back up again, his expression unchanged. He didn't reach for them immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight as he studied Cassian in a way that felt less transactional now and more deliberate.
"You've got a look about you,"
Brannick muttered after a second, his voice quieter than before.
"Kind of look that says you think you understand what you're walking into."
Cassian stared at him. Brannick huffed faintly, not quite a laugh.
"You don't,"
he said simply. His hand finally moved, pulling the coins toward him, and he looked back up at them.
"When you're down there,"
he continued, tapping once against the map with the charcoal still between his fingers,
"you're gonna hear things.
Siberic huffed and raised his eyebrows.
Voices.
Brannick clarified, his tone flattening into something more serious.
Sounds that don't belong. People calling out.
Cassian shifted his weight and his posture sharpened just a fraction.
Don't answer it,
Brannick said, his voice firm now, cutting through the quiet of the tavern like a line drawn in stone.
Don't follow it, and don't go looking for it.
His eye drifted for just a moment, not to them, but somewhere past them, as if the memory of it sat just out of reach but close enough to feel.
Doesn't matter how real it sounds,
he added.
It ain't.
Cassian held his gaze, measuring him, but there was nothing performative in the warning, no embellishment, just a man stating something he had learned the hard way. Brannick's attention returned fully to them as he lifted the charcoal again and jabbed it lightly at the parchment, marking a few uneven circles along the drawn tunnels.
Now watch the walls,
he said.
You'll see breaks in the stone, holes where the rock's been carved through. Some of them go nowhere.
The charcoal pressed harder against one of the marks.
Some of them do.
Siberic's voice came low. What's in them? Brannick's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel wrong.
Things that don't bother with pleasantries,
he replied. The answer sat there, unfinished, but complete enough. He leaned back again, setting the charcoal down with a quiet tap against the table. For a moment, it seemed like he was done. Then, almost as an afterthought, his eye lifted again.
And if you make it out on the other side,
he said, his tone shifting just slightly, not lighter, but different.
Keep your eyes open on the climb.
He paused for a moment.
Snow's not the only thing that's dangerous up there. Big bastard. Taller than a man by at least half. White fur. Doesn't care much for company.
Siberic and Cassian exchanged glances. Brannick gave a small, dismissive shrug, as though the warning didn't belong to him anymore the moment he'd said it.
Yep,
he muttered, reaching for his drink again.
That's about it. Good luck and stuff.
Conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Cassian took the map, folding it once with careful precision, and gave the old man a final, measured look, and then turned around without another word. Siberic followed him back across the tavern, their footsteps steady against the warped floor as the low murmur of the room returned around them. The others looked up as they approached, attention sharpening immediately as Cassian set the folded parchment down at the center of the table. Well? Juno asked, her eyes already moving to the map. Cassian rested a hand lightly against the table, his gaze sweeping across the group. We have a map. Well, sort of a map, he said. Siberic grunted, and a list of things to avoid, too. The map sat between them for a moment, its presence enough to quiet whatever lingering doubt remained. The weight of the decision didn't need to be debated further. Cassian broke the silence first, folding the edge of the map slightly under his hand as he looked around the table. We leave at first thing tomorrow morning, he said, his voice steady and final. We get some rest, we pack what we need for the mines, and we move before anything else in this place has time to change. Juno nodded, already thinking ahead. We'll need to keep it light and stay together, she added. If those tunnels are as unstable as he says, we can't afford to be spread out. Dorian leaned back slightly in his chair, though the tension in his shoulders hadn't fully left. I'll review the layout again before we leave, he said, more to himself than anyone else. If there are structural patterns in how those tunnels were carved, there may be predictable collapse points. Jackson glanced toward the door as if he could already feel the cold waiting outside. Great, he muttered. Let's get lost in an abandoned mine shaft under the mountain we're trying to get to the top of. Great plan. You are always so negative, Leaf replied. It could always be worse. We have seen worse. Jackson shrugged, but he knew he was right. Siberic pushed off from where he stood. Time to get some rest, then. No use lingering around in this dump. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as the group stood. The tavern didn't react to them leaving. No one here cared where they were going or whether they came back. Just another group passing through, same as the rest. Cassian took one last look at the table, making sure nothing had been left behind, then turned toward the door. The others followed, their footsteps steady but unhurried as they crossed the room. Before they reached the exit, the door opened with a low creak, letting a breath of cold air spill inside, and a shadow moved across the threshold. 4 figures stepped in from the night, their presence cutting cleanly through the quiet of the tavern without needing to announce itself. Dark leather, worn but well kept, cloaks pulled low, weapons visible but not flaunted. They carried themselves like men who were used to being noticed and didn't mind. The 3 in front paused just long enough to take in the room, their eyes sweeping once across the scattered patrons before shifting aside. The 4th stepped through behind them. Shorter, with a slim but curvy figure even in the leather armor and cloak, the woman's hood stayed up for a moment longer than the others, shadowing her face as she moved past them and into the lamplight. Then, with a small, swift motion, she reached up and pulled it back. Blonde hair fell loose around her shoulders, catching the glow of the lanterns in soft strands that contrasted sharply against the dark leathers she wore. Her face was striking without any effort, her lips naturally set in a slight pout that gave her expression an edge even when she wasn't trying. There was confidence in the way she stood, in the way her eyes moved through the room, measuring, dismissing, already deciding what mattered and what didn't. For a moment, she looked like she owned the place. Then her gaze landed on Dion and everything about her shifted. It wasn't dramatic, but the edge slipped, just enough to notice. The practiced toughness gave way to something more immediate, more real, as recognition hit her all at once. Dion? She said, the name leaving her before she could stop it. Dion was already staring back. He froze where he stood, halfway between the table and the door, his brow pulling together as his eyes locked onto her. For a second, it looked like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. Celine? He said, confused and surprised at the same time. Jackson's eyes flicked between the two, already catching the shift in energy and the tension building. Celine took a step forward without thinking, the faintest trace of a smile pulling at her lips despite herself. Whatever she had been a second ago, a mercenary, a thief, or something harder, was gone, replaced by something far less guarded. What are you doing in a place like this? I thought you were dead, she said. Dion blinked once, then straightened slightly, his chest lifting in a way that was almost instinctive. Dion is very hard to kill, he replied, smiling broadly. Behind her, the 3 men she had entered with exchanged a glance, the kind that came from not expecting this turn in the night. They left her side and found a table nearby. Celine laughed softly. Well, I know that, but we heard things, months ago, that maybe you had left us for good. Dion's hesitation melted out of him all at once, replaced by something far more familiar. His shoulders relaxed, his expression opening in a way the group hadn't seen since before the forge, before the masks, before everything had started to stack too high. Dion not dead. Very alive, he said as he stepped toward her. Dion thought maybe you got eaten by something terrible. Or maybe you forgot about Dion entirely. Celine let out another chuckle, settling into a comfortable conversation, her eyes lingering on him a second longer than necessary. Not yet, she replied. Came close a few times, though. But how could I forget about you, silly? The distance between them closed naturally, without calculation. She reached out first, her hand brushing against his arm, then settling it there like it had every right to be. Dion didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned into it slightly, his attention fully locked on her now, the rest of the room fading into something distant and unimportant. You look... She started, then paused, her gaze moving over him as if trying to reconcile memory with what stood in front of her. Exactly the same. Dion grinned, the reaction immediate and unfiltered. Dion works out, he said simply, as though that explained everything. Behind them, Jackson shifted his weight, one brow lifting as he glanced sideways toward the others. Well, he murmured under his breath. This just got awkward. Juno didn't answer. She stood off to the side, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on the two of them as Celine's hand remained on Dion's arm a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't what they were saying, it was what wasn't being said. The ease of it, the familiarity, the way Dion, without realizing it, had turned his entire focus toward her as if nothing else in the room required his attention. Celine withdrew her hand slowly, though the space between them didn't widen. "We've been running out of New Tristan," she said, nodding briefly toward the men behind her. "Work's been steady, hunting contracts, escort jobs, clearing out things that shouldn't be where they are." One of the men gave a small acknowledging nod at that, though he didn't interrupt. The others leaned casually against the wall, watching the exchange with quiet interest. "New Tristan," Dorian repeated. Curious why an advanced city like that would have use for sellswords. More to himself than to her, filing it away as his eyes moved between the group. Celine glanced toward him briefly but didn't acknowledge him, then back to Dion. "You?" she asked. "What have you been doing all this time?" Dion opened his mouth, then paused, as if trying to condense everything into something simple. "Dion has been busy," he said at last, which was somehow both entirely true and completely insufficient. Celine smiled at that, the expression softening her features just enough to make the contrast with her earlier demeanor even sharper, and she glanced at Juno. "I'm sure you have, big man." Juno's hand tightened slightly around the handle of her hammer, though she hadn't moved otherwise. Her gaze flicked once to Cassian, then back to Dion as he continued talking, his voice low and steady in a way that suggested he wasn't thinking about anything beyond the moment in front of him. "It was rough, but Dion found new friends," Dion was saying, gesturing loosely as he spoke. "Good friends, strong friends. You should meet them. They are right here." Celine leaned in just slightly, listening, her attention unwavering. "Well, you did always like it rough, Dion," she replied with a smirk. "Are these your friends?" Dion blushed and grinned weakly. "Yes, Dion's friends are—" Before he could finish his sentence, Juno's patience for the situation snapped. She turned sharply, the motion controlled but decisive, and started for the door without a word. Cassian noticed immediately. "Juno!" But she was already gone, the door opening with a quick pull before shutting behind her with a dull, final thud that carried more weight than the sound itself should have. The room held the echo of it for a second. Dion blinked, his head turning toward the door as if only just realizing something had shifted. "Juno leave?" he said, confusion threading through his voice. Celine's gaze followed his, her expression flickering with a snarky smile. "New girlfriend, Dion?" she asked, though the answer was already obvious. Dion hesitated. "Well," he said, slower now, "Juno is complicated. She is a girl that is a friend." "I don't think she likes me, Dion," Celine replied. Juno hated Dion at first, too. "She will come around," he said with a broad smile, completely unaware of the tension that still sat in the room. Cassian stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm as he redirected the moment. "We should go," he said to the group, his eyes briefly meeting Dion's before shifting back toward the door. "We've got an early start." Saberic didn't wait for further discussion. He turned and moved toward the exit, his pace steady and unbothered by the tension left behind. Gabriel followed after him, his expression displayed a slight snarl as he looked Celine up and down before following the others. Jackson lingered just long enough to give Dion a look that said more than words would have, then clapped him lightly on the shoulder as he passed. "Don't take too long, you'll regret it later," he muttered. Dorian was the last to move, his gaze flicking once between Celine and Dion before turning away as well, already retreating into thought. The door shut behind them. Outside, the air bit immediately, sharp and clean, carrying the distant weight of the mountains looming overhead. Juno stood a few paces from the tavern, her back to them, arms crossed tightly as she stared out into the dark. As the group gathered around her, she spit into the cold wind and they walked back to camp. They needed to rest, and whatever had just been stirred inside that tavern would have to follow them into the morning. Inside the tavern, Dion and Celine had found an empty table and sat down across from each other. The space felt smaller now, more focused, narrowed down to the distance between them. She looked at him closely, studying him, her expression even softer now that the others were gone. "You were always disappearing on me," she said, though there wasn't much bite in it. "I figured one day I'd hear you got yourself killed doing something stupid or brave." Dion huffed faintly, folding his arms across his chest in that familiar grounded stance. "Dion does many stupid things. he admitted. But those things always work out. That earned another quiet smile, one that lingered longer this time. She leaned a little closer, not enough to crowd him, but enough that the distance between them felt intentional. We've been doing good work, she said, her tone shifting just slightly. Real work, contracts that pay, hunts that matter. New Tristan's been busy lately. Lots of things crawling out of places they shouldn't be. Her eyes flicked up to meet his. You'd fit right in. Dion didn't answer immediately. His gaze dropped for a second, then lifted again, as if weighing the offer not just on his face, but on everything it implied. Celine saw it. She always had a way of reading him faster than most. It could be like it was before, she added, her voice lowering just enough to carry something more personal beneath the words. No politics, no whatever this is. She gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the world beyond it. Just the road, the job, and the people who know how to survive it. She leaned even closer, just inside the edge of his space now, her hand lifting as if out of habit before resting lightly against his chest. You were good at it, she said. We were good at it. The implication sat there, clear without needing to be said outright. Dion froze. It would have been so easy, simple even. The path she was offering didn't come with masks, or ancient rituals, or a world on the edge of collapse. It came with something familiar, something proven, something that had worked once before. His hand lifted slightly, hovering for a second, as if deciding whether to rest over hers. Then it dropped back to his side. Celine is good, he said instead, his voice steady, but quieter than before. Dion thinks about Celine sometimes. Her expression didn't change, but the expectation in her eyes sharpened just a fraction. But Dion is not that man anymore, he continued, meeting her gaze fully now. Things are different. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Celine's hand remained where it was for a second longer, then slowly slipped away. She leaned back just enough to study him again, this time with a different kind of attention. You always were stubborn, she said. Dion gave a small shrug. At least Dion is consistent. That pulled a short breath of a laugh out of her, though it didn't quite carry the same lightness as before. She shook her head once, more to herself than to him. You're really walking away from me again? She asked, her tone quieter, less certain. Dion didn't hesitate this time. Not again. Dion didn't come back in the first place. Celine held his gaze for a long moment, searching for something that wasn't there anymore, or maybe something that was, just changed in a way she hadn't expected. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate. All right then, she said. I guess you've got somewhere you need to be. Dion glanced toward the door, then back to her. Yes. A beat passed between them, heavier now, but not broken. Good luck. Try not to die. But don't call for help if you're in trouble, she added with a clear hint of disappointment and disapproval. Dion nodded. Dion will try. He stood and walked for the door, not rushing, not hesitating. When he pushed it open, the cold night air hit him immediately, sharp against his skin and beard. By the time Dion returned to the camp, the fire had burned low, reduced to a bed of glowing embers that cast just enough light to define the edges of the space without chasing away the darkness beyond it. Most of the group had already settled. Sabaric lay near the outer edge of the camp, his position deliberate even in rest, one hand never far from his weapon. Gabriel sat with his back against one of the wagon wheels, eyes closed but posture upright, as though sleep for him was more of a matter of stillness than surrender. Dorian was further off, a faint glow from his gauntlet flickering intermittently as he worked through something only he could see. Cassian glanced up as Dion approached, his expression neutral but aware. Welcome back, he said. Dion nodded, but his eyes moved to the wagon. The curtain had been drawn closed. He stepped closer and reached for the canvas, then stopped just short of pulling it aside. For a second, he stood there listening. Silence. Inside, Juno didn't move. She lay on the bedroll with her back to the opening. Dion's hand hovered for a moment, then dropped. He stepped back from the wagon and moved to the edge of the fire, lowering himself onto the ground with a slow exhale as he leaned forward slightly. The warmth from the embers barely touched him, but he didn't seem to notice. The night settled around them. At first light, wind tore across the clearing in restless bursts, dragging loose snow and grit across the ground and rattling the wagon's frame with a hollow, uneven rhythm. By the time Cassian opened his eyes, the fire had long since burned out, leaving only a smear of dark ash where the embers had been. He pushed himself upright slowly, breath already visible in the air as he scanned the camp. The others were stirring, each in their own way, the quiet tension of the night replaced by the simple, immediate need to move. Sabarik was already on his feet, checking the perimeter of the camp, his boots crunching lightly against the frozen ground. Gabriel sat where he had rested, eyes open now, watching the horizon without speaking. Dion shifted last, rolling his shoulders as he stood, the stiffness of the cold settling into his frame. His gaze moved instinctively toward the wagon. The curtain was still drawn. He didn't approach it this time. Juno stepped down from the opposite side a moment later, already geared, her expression set and unreadable as she moved past him without acknowledgement. The distance between them remained intact, unspoken but solid, as she crossed the clearing toward Cassian. "We need to get moving," she said, her tone direct, as if nothing else needed to be addressed. Cassian nodded. "We're ready." No one else argued. Packing was quick and intentional. What they needed for the mines was gathered and secured, the rest left in place within the wagon. The decision came easily. Whatever waited for them beneath the mountain, they would not be hauling their entire lives through it. Thorin stood near the front of the wagon, the faint blue glow within his helm cutting through the gray of the morning as he observed without comment. Benny remained close to Vera, the dog's posture alert despite the stillness of the woman beside him. Cassian approached the wagon last, his hand resting briefly against its side as he looked between them. "You guys stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Guard her, guard the wagon." Thorin inclined his head. "That is acceptable." Benny gave a quiet huff, as if in agreement. Dion stepped closer as well, his expression softening just slightly as he looked down at the dog. "You protect," he said, pointing once between Benny and Vera. "No leaving." Benny's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Satisfied, Dion stepped back with a smile. Cassian walked quickly to the tavern and found the barkeep already awake and stoking a fire in the hearth. He grunted a good morning and kept tending to his task. Cassian didn't exchange pleasantries. He set a small stack of coins on the counter, the sound drawing the man's full attention. "We've got a wagon outside in a clearing," he said. "Supplies, someone who can't be moved inside. It's being looked after while we're gone, but we need extra eyes on it if possible." The barkeep glanced down at the coin, then back up, his expression unreadable for a moment before settling into something practical. "For how long?" "Hopefully within a day," Cassian replied. The man considered that, then reached forward, dragging the coin toward him with a rough hand. "I'll keep an eye on it," he said. "Nothing in this place moves in or out without me seeing it. This is the only place to pass through." Cassian gave the man a nod in agreement. "That is all we need." As they turned to leave, Dion glanced once toward the far corner of the room where Celine had been the night before. It was empty. Her crew were gone too. Whatever presents they had brought with them erased as cleanly as if they had never been there. "Guess she didn't stick around, huh, buddy?" Jackson muttered under his breath. Dion didn't answer. Outside, the wind hit harder than before, driving down from the mountains in long, relentless gusts that made the path ahead feel narrower than it was. The peaks loomed above them now in the daylight, no longer distant shapes but towering, jagged walls of snow and stone that seemed to swallow the sky itself. They left the small encampment behind and started on foot toward the entrance of the mine. The path ahead of them through the sparse forest curved upward slowly, cutting toward the base of the range before breaking off into rougher ground where the land began to fracture under the weight of the mountains. Snow gathered in uneven patches, broken by exposed rock and the occasional splintered remains of old markers that had long since lost their meaning. The closer they got, the quieter it became. No movement beyond the wind, just the sound of their own steps and the distant, constant groan of shifting ice somewhere above. After about a half an hour, the entrance to the Mines of Misery revealed itself. A jagged opening into the base of the mountain, partially swallowed by collapsed stone and drifts of packed snow that had hardened into something closer to ice. The structure around the opening looked ancient, the wooden supports splintered and warped, iron braces bent out of shape or half buried where the mountain had pushed back against them. An empty void waited beyond the threshold. "Just as he said," Gabriel murmured quietly. Dorian stepped forward slightly, his gaze sharpening as he studied the structure with a more analytical eye. "Older than I expected," he said, "and less stable." "That is not reassuring," Jackson replied. Juno didn't look back. Her focus remained on the entrance, her grip tightening slightly around her shield and hammer as the wind cut across the opening, carrying a faint, hollow sound from somewhere deep inside. Cassian took a step forward. "Stay close." They took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The cold followed them inside. It changed as soon as they crossed the threshold. shifting from the biting, open air of the mountains into something heavier, wetter, clinging to the skin and cloth in a way that made the space feel tighter than it was. The light from outside didn't carry far. Within a few steps, it was already fading, swallowed by the depth of the tunnels ahead. Darkness settled over them quickly. Dorian's gauntlet gave off a faint, steady glow, just enough to define the immediate space around them, while Cassian and Leaf's vision adjusted faster than the rest, their eyes already scanning ahead into what little detail the darkness allowed. The ground beneath their boots was uneven, damp in places where water had seeped through stone and pooled into shallow depressions. The air carried a smell that hit them in waves, sharp and sour at the same time, sulfur, unmistakable, layered over something older, something rotting. Jackson made a face as he pulled his collar slightly higher over his mouth. "That's not pleasant," he muttered, his voice low enough not to carry. "No," Gabriel replied quietly, "it's not." They moved slowly down the first corridor, Cassian scanning the crude map Brannick drew as they walked. Quickly the mind split into multiple paths, narrow corridors branching off at irregular angles, some collapsing inward, others opening wider before disappearing into shadow. It wasn't just a tunnel, it was a network, a maze carved out over time, then left to decay without care for what came after. Dorian slowed, his eyes moving quickly across the structure, taking in the angles, the supports, the way the rock had shifted. "It's hard to follow the map. These tunnels look like they have been changed 1,000,000 times, he said under his breath. They moved carefully, every step cautious, placed with the awareness that sound carried differently here. Boots struck stone with muted weight, gear adjusted in quiet motions, breath kept controlled as they pushed deeper into the tunnels. Even Dion, who rarely concerned himself with subtlety, had instinctively lowered his presence, his movements slower, quieter. Remnants of the mine that once was appeared in pieces as they advanced. Broken rails jutted up from the ground at uneven angles, some even still embedded in the stone, while others had been torn free and left scattered across the path. Rusted minecarts sat half-collapsed against walls, their wheels bent, their frames warped from time or pressure. A variety of tools littered the halls. Picks, hammers, things left behind in a hurry or never retrieved, lay where they had fallen, coated in grime and neglect. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became. Sulfur thickened in the air, mixing with something else that clung to the back of the throat, something that made breathing feel a little heavier than it should have. Cassian raised a hand slightly, slowing the group as his gaze shifted ahead. The tunnel narrowed there, the walls pressing in just enough to force them closer together as the path curved gently out of sight. He listened for a moment, craning his neck just slightly as he focused on something the others hadn't picked up yet. The sound came from the darkness, faint and distant, almost an echo. "Help!" The word barely carried, thin and strained, like it had been dragged across too much distance to reach them clearly. Juno's head snapped toward the sound immediately. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. They all froze. Of course they heard it. "Please, someone!" A child's voice, weak, echoing through the tunnels ahead. Jackson winced, the tension in his posture tightening as his eyes flicked toward Cassian. "That's not right," he said. "It can't be." Dorian's gauntlet flared to life, locking onto the direction of the sound. "It's coming from deeper down the tunnel," he murmured. Another call, softer this time, more desperate. The sound bounced strangely off the walls, warping just enough that it was hard to tell exactly where it originated. Ahead, somewhere to the side, it didn't sit cleanly in the space the way a normal voice should. Gabriel exhaled, his gaze steady but darkened with recognition. "Brannick warned us," he said. "Voices that don't belong." Juno shook her head. Her focus remained fixed on the tunnel, her grip tightening around her weapon. "That sounds real," she said. Cassian turned slightly to her, his voice low, controlled. "That doesn't matter. There's no way there is a child in here. It can't be real." The voice came again, closer. "Help!" The sound stretched through the mine, thin and trembling, carrying just enough detail to feel real, just enough emotion to pull at instinct. Dion shifted his weight, his brow furrowing as he looked toward the darkness. "Dion thinks Kid is hurt," he said quietly. Cassian's eyes didn't leave the tunnel. "Something wants us to think it is." Beside him, Leaf moved closer to the wall. "If it is someone," he said quietly, "we have to help them." Dorian huffed in exasperation, irritation cutting through the tension. "And if it isn't?" Leaf didn't look at him. "Then we deal with it." That is not a plan, Dorian replied, his voice low but edged. That's how people die in places like this. Cassian finally spoke, calm and firm. Then we don't all rush to the sound blindly. He glanced back to the group, then toward Leaf. The two of us will go ahead, quiet. We confirm what it is. Dorian's eyes snapped back to him. And if it's exactly what Brannick warned us about? Then we come back and we regroup, Cassian said simply. The voice came again, thinner now, strained. Help me. Silence followed it. Leaf gave a small nod. We'll make it fast. Dorian didn't like it. That much was clear in the set of his jaw and the way his fingers flexed once at the side before settling again. I don't like the idea of splitting up, especially when we were warned of this exact thing, he muttered. Then we'd better make it quick, Cassian replied. He stepped forward without another word. Leaf followed closely behind. The two of them moved carefully toward the source of the sound. The faint light behind them fell away quickly, leaving them in deeper shadow. Cassian raised one hand slightly, signaling a stop as the tunnel curved ahead. He listened for the call or anything else that might clue them in to what they were about to walk into. Leaf crouched slightly beside him, eyes narrowing as he studied the ground, the walls, and the shape of the corridor. Something's been through here recently, he whispered, footprints scraping more than walking. He leaned just enough to see past the curve. Then he stopped and stood completely still. Cassian followed his gaze and understood why he had froze. The tunnel opened just beyond the bend, not wide, but wide enough to reveal what stood within it. 3 figures stood in a tight circle, huddled together, unmoving. At a distance, the silhouettes looked eerily human, upright, 2 arms, a head, but the closer they inspected, the more it fell apart. Their skin was pale, stretched too thin across elongated frames that seemed to pull in unnatural directions. Their limbs were too long, their joints slightly off, as if something had taken the idea of a human body and reshaped it without permission. Milky, clouded eyes stared forward, unfocused and useless, reflecting no light at all. They didn't track movement, they didn't blink. Their ears extended outward from the sides of their heads, thin and stretched, twitching slightly with each subtle shift in the air. Not human ears, something closer to a bat's, fine and sensitive, constantly adjusting as if mapping the space around them through sound alone. One of them tilted its head back, and in a voice that did not belong, it spoke. Please, help. The sound came out warped, like it had been pulled from memory and forced through a throat not meant to shape it. The tone was wrong. The cadence was just slightly off, but close enough to be convincing. Leaf's jaw tightened. That's not a child, he whispered. Cassian's gaze moved slowly across them, taking in the details. Their arms ended wrong. Where hands should have been, metal jutted from flesh. Mining tools fused and grown into their bodies. Rusted picks and jagged iron edges protruded from bone, as if they had been absorbed rather than held. The metal wasn't clean. It was embedded and twisted, part of them now. One shifted slightly, its head turning just enough to catch the faintest echo of their breathing. Listening. Leaf hissed through his teeth. What are they doing? He murmured. Cassian didn't take his eyes off them. Waiting, he said quietly. Another voice came from one of the creatures, softer this time, almost curious. Hello? The 3 of them stood there, unmoving otherwise, but the air around them felt alive with attention. Cassian's voice dropped, controlled and certain. No, they're hunting. The realization settled in without needing to be spoken. The voice wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lost traveler or a child buried somewhere in the tunnels. It was bait. Leaf studied the 3 figures ahead, tracking the subtle shifts in their posture, the way their heads angled just slightly with each breath he and Cassian took. They weren't guarding anything. They weren't waiting for someone to pass. They were waiting for someone to answer. We should go back. We need to tell the others, Leaf whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Cassian didn't argue. He gave a small nod and began to shift his weight, turning slowly, carefully, every movement measured to keep from sending unnecessary sound down the corridor. The creatures ahead remained still, their milky eyes useless, their ears twitching faintly as they listened, searching for confirmation that something living stood beyond their reach. Cassian took one step back, then another. Leaf followed. Just behind them, a stone shifted. A sound so small that it should have been nothing, just the faint scrape of something against rock. but in the silence of the mine it carried like a crack of thunder. Cassian froze. Leaf's head turned slowly toward the source. One of the walls near them wasn't solid. A dark opening yawned low along the stone, jagged and uneven, just large enough for something to move through, and something was already halfway out. It unfolded itself from the darkness. Long limbs pressed against the rock, joints bending in directions that resembled an arachnid, but larger than anything they had ever seen. It climbed rather than stepped, its body clinging to the wall as it pulled itself free of the hole, each movement slow, controlled, and silent in a way that felt unnatural for something so large. Cassian's breath slowed. He had heard of this abomination, a rumor from his days as a justiciar, half man, half spider, and pure evil. Night Stalker, he said under his breath, the word carrying recognition and warning in equal measure. The creature paused after clearing the entrance of the hole. Its body spread across the wall, 8 limbs anchoring it to stone and sealing alike as it lifted itself higher, repositioning with eerie precision. At the front of a twisted, deformed abdomen was a face. A human face, or what looked like it had once been. Pale skin stretched tight over a skull that didn't quite hold its shape. Instead of 2 eyes, there were 4, catching what little light there was and throwing it back in dull, glassy glints. Its mouth hung slightly open, revealing rows of thin, needle-like teeth that clicked faintly as it shifted. Cassian didn't move. Leaf didn't breathe. The Night Stalker crept forward along the wall, its limbs landing with impossible care, claws scraping just enough against the stone to make a faint, dry sound that set every nerve on edge. Behind them, the 3 figures in the tunnel shifted, ears twitching toward the subtle sounds of the creature's movement. One of them spoke again.
Hello? Who's there?
The voice dragged through the space, wrong and hollow. The Night Stalker's head twitched, tracking the voice. Leaf's hand tightened slowly at his side. We're cut off, he whispered. Cassian's eyes flicked once toward the path ahead, then back toward the creature above them, already measuring distance, movement, and timing. Not yet, he said quietly.